if you do controversial work, it's difficult to get funding. And where obviously I spend a lot of my time looking for funding to keep the experiments going. The theory is not an issue, but there are many experiments that I would like to be able to do, and they require people and they require money, and it's difficult to get the money from usual sources.
Hello and welcome. I'm Sarah, and today I speak to one of the world's leading water researchers, Dr. Gerald Pollack, about his groundbreaking research into the fourth phase of water, also known as structured water, coherent water, and its implications for our health. Because water provides not only information for the body, but also energy as well, as in our life force. Dr. Pollack describes why he moved into water research, which is still controversial, after learning about Gilbert Ling's work on water, because if Ling was right, then a lot of biology is wrong. Dr. Pollack's going to walk you through the fourth phase of water and why it's like our second battery, how it lubricates our molecular machinery, and also his published experiments showing how light and different compounds like turmeric and glyphosate can change the size of the exclusion zone water. And he's also going to tell you about his ultimate grounding experience to gather electrons. The podcast suddenly changed direction because we were discussing structuring water using electricity and making bioactive molecules. And Dr. Pollack revealed he has an unpublished book. Well, he's actually got two, and one of them's on electricity. So we went off down another rabbit hole. After Dr. Pollack explains a bit about weather manipulation, I ask him about his theories on aging or anti-aging in humans. And the answer he gives surprises me a bit and got me thinking. But then as mammals, we did originate from dark burrows. So I hope you enjoy this interview, and I've linked all of Dr. Pollack's work in the description, and I've also uploaded one of his TED Talks for you if you're brand new to this, so that you can familiarize yourself with water. Welcome, Dr. Pollack. Would you like to tell everybody who you are and why I consider you as a water expert? And we're going to be talking a lot about water today.
I live in Seattle. I'm a professor at the University of Washington. Many people who don't realize that we're not Washington University, but the University of Washington. Washington University is St. Louis. Everyone gets it confused. There are so many Washingtons, so many universities with the name Washington. I could probably reel off at least 7 or 8 of them throughout the country. I'm in Seattle. Water is my second career. We started out studying the mechanism, the molecular mechanism of muscle contraction. And I spent a couple of decades doing that, and we learned so much about how muscles contract. And then one day I was introduced at a conference in Hungary. I was introduced to the idea that water plays a much more significant role in biology than we might have thought. Those who are educated in somewhat, at least in biology, will have learned that water is merely a background carrier of the more important molecules of life. It doesn't do anything really. It just sits there and is a solvent. And I learned at this conference that was absolutely untrue. And the person who made the difference for me, a guy named Gilbert Ling, who passed a couple of years ago, age almost 100, and he was chosen in the first cohort of young students to come from China to study in the US. And he was accompanied by 2 others. There was a chemist, a physicist, and he was a biologist. And I know the physicist won a Nobel Prize, and a colleague told me that the chemist also won a Nobel Prize. And Gilbert Ling should have won 2 Nobel Prizes for all that he did, but he was controversial. Anyway, I listened to what he had to say. He said that biological water is different from water in a glass. So water in a glass, the molecules are randomly oriented relative to one another and bouncing around at a fierce number of times each second, or even each femtosecond. And he said, no, the evidence is otherwise. He said, the molecules are organized like soldiers at attention. So he referred to that as structured water, and I think some other people before him had also talked about water that has structure. Of course, everything has structure, but what he meant is that it was organized, and this was anathema to people in the field, because the idea that water might be organized, it didn't make sense to them. Everybody knows everybody knew there are three phases of water: the solid, liquid, vapor. And he was talking about something that deviated from any of those, or all of those. And so I was really impressed, and I was so impressed, and I was impressed also by the people at the meeting who presented evidence to support Gilbert Ling's point of view. So I went home, I took one of Gilbert Ling's books, I showed it to some of my students, postdocs, and their response was almost identical. It was, this guy, if he's right, all of biology is wrong. Everything we've learned of biology is wrong, because water is not the way we see it. And that got me inspired, and so we moved into the field of water. I wrote a book, trying, and the objective was to try to express Gilbert Ling's points of view in a way that might be palatable to non-experts. I'm not sure if I succeeded or not, because some reviews said, "Oh, this is more of Gilbert Ling, and everybody knows that Gilbert Ling is a crackpot, so forget it." And there were also some very positive reviews. And then we started doing experiments, because after all, if you're into,
you mentioned, is it the fourth phase of water, your book? Because I've got that, because I wasn't sure if you had more than one, because the listeners always like to get books and things.
no, this one is called Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life.
Oh, right. Okay. I've not read that one. I've read the fourth phase of water. Which one would you recommend for people who are starting? Obviously, you can say both.
Well, it depends on their interest. So Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life deals mostly with biology and what happens. The fourth phase of water has become popular to the extreme. I guess that's the more recent one, and I guess that would be the first one to look at. It deals with water and many aspects of water, and the principles apply absolutely to biology. So I think some people have remarked to me that they first read the fourth phase of water, and then after that they went back to read Cells, Gels, and the Engines of Life. And the latter book, Cells, Gels, is now more than 20 years old, and we learned some things experimentally since that book was published. And I think the principles apply. There's only one difference, and the kind of structure that exists of the water. We were able to confirm the structure, but it's different. It's actually considerably different from what Gilbert Ling was thinking, and what I wrote about in the first book, Cells, Gels, the Engines of Life. And I can tell you about that. I will tell you about that. But the difference is, it's rather, it's more than just subtle. It makes a huge difference. And so and I have to tell you, just a funny thing. I tried to find out. I was curious. Someone wrote to me and said, your work is more important than that of Richard Feynman. So Richard Feynman, Richard Feynman, but many people don't. And Feynman is a Nobel physicist who many people consider to be the Einstein of the second half of the previous century. And he was also funny, and which maybe contributed. And that inspired me to look at the popularity of his book, The Lectures of Richard Feynman. That book is read by virtually every graduate student in physics in the U.S. He's like a hero, and they all know him. And so I compared. I looked on Amazon just out of curiosity to see how popular his book is. It's a 3-volume book, and it turns out that the review rating is exactly the same as the fourth phase of water. So
Oh, that's brilliant.
I was impressed. So yeah, it's popular, I think, because book is popular because it tries to present in simple terms what we discovered about water. And I think what we discovered is really important because it pertains not only to biology, but well beyond biology.
Oh,
So let me,
definitely.
this is what your question was, tell me about yourself and what you're doing. And
Oh,
I
no,
think
that's fine, because you've actually led me into the next question, because also you've got two TED Talks as well, because I thought you only had one. And I think the TED Talk, when you were talking about water as free energy, because people just think we get energy from food, that would be something else to elaborate on. And then
sure.
also the other thing I really liked in that TED Talk was his explaining the biological relevance of the structured water. But and also how sort of loosely it would form in the body, because I think people are now probably interested in water, but us being more of biologists than physicists who listen and watch to this, I think people would like to know a bit about maybe this TED Talk, what you said and how you sort of made it digestible to the public to get them interested. Like, I didn't know who you were then and thought, oh, that was a good talk. And I think what captured me was the fact that water can provide energy.
Yes. Okay. Let me start with that, and then I probably will forget your second question. There were a couple of them, so please refresh me after I tell. So, maybe it's best if I relate that in the context, a chronological context. We were, I mean, the potential energy question. We were curious to follow up on Gilbert Ling, and we started by thinking the idea that the molecules were lined up. If the molecules are lined up, it's kind of like a crystal, and as crystals form, what they do, if you have a pure crystal and it forms from a liquid, the liquid has to get rid of any impurities. Otherwise, the crystal won't be pure. It would contain impurities. So, I mean, example is ice when it forms from liquid water. If the liquid water has impurities, the impurities get kicked out in order to get pure ice. So we were looking experimentally for experimental preparation where we could see that particles or solutes were kicked out in some kind of water-based experiment. So we took a gel and we added water and particles. The particles were little spheres called microspheres. And we looked in the microscope, and adjacent to the gel in the water, we could see a region where there were no microspheres, a very substantial region. Plenty of microspheres beyond that, but not inside of it. And so as we studied this more and more, we found that the properties of this, we called it initially exclusion zone because it excluded, Later, we called it fourth phase water because we found experimentally that so many of the features of this exclusion zone water were differed from liquid water, and that gave rise to the idea of the fourth phase of water. And one of the measurements leads directly to an answer to your question. We took tiny electrodes, micro electrodes, parenthetically introduced, devised by the same Gilbert Ling, which a lot of scientists used afterward, got Nobel Prizes. He didn't. Anyway, we stuck it in this zone, and we found that the zone was negatively charged. Now, that didn't fit Gilbert Ling's ideas because you can stack water molecules. As I said, he thought they were lined up like soldiers at attention. but you can line up the soldiers or line up the water molecules, which are neutral, from here to the moon, and you'll never get negative charge. But we measured negative charge. And we also measured beyond the exclusion zone, the negatively charged exclusion zone, away from the gel, we found positive charge. So if you have negative charge separated from positive charge, you've got a battery. And so the battery contains energy. And if you've got this inside your body, which I'll address, that's your second question, I think, you've got energy. And so of course we all get energy from food, but the question is, if we've got this this kind of organized water inside our bodies, we got batteries inside our body, so to speak, and batteries can produce energy. And so, yes, we could go into much more detail about how this energy gets utilized. But the bottom line is that we get energy both from food and also from water, because the water inside our body is mostly this EZ or fourth phase water, and all of these charges are meaningful. We don't know how much of this energy, how much of our energy comes from the water and how much comes from the food, and that's something for the future to find out. But when you think about the people who don't eat, well, where do they get their energy? They could get their energy from this fourth phase of water.
Do you mean breatharians?
Breatharians, right.
Yes, because they go out in the sun a lot as well, because that's the other thing about water, can receive energy, can't it? I know I've just jumped the gun to the next question, but
yes,
that's exactly what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking about the breatharians, because people try and say they're making it up, but I know some and they're not. So, and I think it's really important for people who've got chronic fatigue or things like that, this idea that water can provide additional energy, because that's what they need.
Absolutely, yeah. So, okay, so let me go back one step. Yes, you jumped the gun.
I did.
I purposely avoided talking about that because I hadn't introduced the energy that builds this battery, or charges the battery, or builds EZ. And we struggled. I struggled quite a lot trying to figure out, where does the energy come from? Because, every battery needs to get charged. You forget to charge your cell phone, and next day is not working. So this is a water battery, you might call it that, and what charges it? So one day, a student, undergraduate student, at one time we had many undergraduate students working in the lab, now fewer because of various administrative issues. But the student was doing an experiment similar to what I told you about a chamber, and stick a gel or some kind of hydrophilic material. It turned out that works just as well, even better. And he's got an exclusion zone next to it, and the separated charges. And he, I don't know what inspired him, but these young students are, they're curious. So he found a lamp sitting right next to him, and he shined a lamp on the preparation, on the chamber, and we noted. He called me in, and I saw something that was astonishing, where he was illuminating. The exclusion zone grew. It grew in his experiment by 3 times, and later we could find up to a 10 times expansion with light. But so we did some experiments to figure out what kind of light, which wavelength of light, and we studied from full range of wavelengths, from at the short end, ultraviolet, through the visible spectrum to infrared. Ultraviolet had no effect, no expansion on it. Later, by the way, just recently, we found that it increases the negative charge.
Okay.
But it doesn't expand it. And then visible light, from the shortest to the longest wavelengths, almost nothing. But when we got to the longer wavelengths or the reds, we saw a little bit of expansion, and then into the infrared, which we can't see, but is all around us, especially the sun. The heat from the sun is essentially infrared energy, and about half of the sun's energy is in the infrared region. That's why it feels warm. So, so we found out in experiments that are published that infrared is really the agent of energy buildup. A lot of people don't know about infrared energy. You know, they think if you look in the toaster and it's glowing a bright orange and feels hot, warm, that it's generating radiant energy or infrared energy. But it's all around us. And if you were to turn off all the lights in your studio and you couldn't see anything, nor could your camera, if you substituted an infrared camera, just switch out the lens in your camera to one that's sensitive, not to visible light, but to infrared light, you get a beautiful image. And that's why the military exploits that for night vision. It works beautifully. We've got a couple of cameras in the lab. It does it. So that means that infrared energy is coming from everywhere. Some like the toaster or your oven, stronger than other, but it's all over the place. And because it's all over, it means that the energy for charging this battery is around all the time. So the battery remains pretty well charged. And in your own body, if you've got water, you have energy, the same energy coming from outside, but also inside. Inside because your metabolism is generating heat, and heat is more or less, not exactly the same, but more or less as infrared energy. So it means your body, if the water in your body is next to hydrophilic surfaces, water-loving surfaces, which is the case for almost all the solids, then your body is going to be filled with this kind of water and the energy that comes along with it. So yes, the breatharians can exploit this energy because it exists in our body. And you know, in terms of producing ATP, that is how should I put it? It's not controversial. However, it might or might not be true. And if anybody has some interest in looking at the website, which still exists, Gilbert Ling, it's gilbertling.org, they'll find something surprising besides what I told you. And Gilbert Ling brings up the idea about energy from ATP. You know, everybody knows that we get energy from ATP. And he says, well, it's not so clear. He said that a prominent physical chemistry or biochemistry group found that in ATP, there's a high energy phosphate bond. And that was quickly taken up by a whole lot of people. It seemed finally somebody figured out where all the energy comes from in our body. But what we don't know, and what he points out, is that a year later, it was challenged by an equally prominent group, physical chemists, who said that the first group made a simple arithmetic error. He points out also that nobody has ever, to his knowledge, followed up. So we're left in a quandary. You know, who's right? Is it the first group, or is it the second group? So, and we don't know the answer. So it may well be that the high energy phosphate bond is where and how we get our energy from food through a fairly complex biochemical route, or it may be bogus. It may not be true. And if it's not true, then the question then reduces to, well, where else might we get energy? And the answer could be that we get possibly all our energy from eventually, ultimately from the water, or certainly at least some. So we don't know the answer to that. And I bring this up because sometimes something appears in the textbook, and we presume that if it's in the textbook, it must be correct. But some things in the textbook are not correct.
There's loads of things that are wrong in textbooks. I could go on for about 3 days about what's wrong in Stryer. But anyway, I don't think people appreciate that water research it used to be a bit taboo, and it still is. And I think you alluded to it earlier that if what we knew about water turns out to be different, it's going to affect a lot of biology and fundamentally change the paradigm. And then as when you were talking about the infrared, I just remembered I wanted to ask, did you, I know you've published some other papers when you found that certain things made the exclusion zone smaller, like too much turmeric or glyphosate, but do you have any other data on how to make more exclusion zone or how to make less, just for people who are interested?
Yes, but let me first correct something. Glyphosate absolutely reduced the size of the exclusion zone, but turmeric did the opposite. You know, turmeric is since Ayurvedic times has been considered good for health, and
wasn't the curve like that though? That a sensible amount of turmeric in the paper was good, but if you put far too much, then it wasn't good for the easy water.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, far too much. But one of the points made is that the amount that tended to expand the exclusion zone was the amount we might expect to find in our body. Too much of anything, in our experience, reduces the size of the exclusion zone. You know, so don't overdo it. But yes, we found not only turmeric over, you know, a fairly wide concentration range, a factor of, I think, 100 in concentration, a range over a factor of 100, roughly. I can't remember the figure exactly. Tended to increase the size of the exclusion zone. And we found also, we studied basil. So-called holy basil, it did the same thing.
Is that Tulsi?
Yes,
Yeah.
right. Tulsi, yeah. And we found ghee did the same. Actually, ghee, clarified butter, also used, you know, by the Ayurvedic people, and continues to be used today. And it was perhaps among the most powerful builders of exclusion zone. So it should be really helpful. We found that aspirin did the same thing. You know, aspirin is natural; it comes from the bark of the willow tree. And there were a few more. I can't recall exactly. So your question was a more general one, or maybe a more specific one. You know, what can you do if you really need easy water to fill your cells? What can you do to do that, to accomplish that? And I just back up and say that one aspect of health we have found is indeed making sure that you have enough easy water in your cells. And the reason for that is that the action of the cell, if it's a muscle cell, we're talking about contraction. If it's a secretory cell, we're talking about secretion, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these processes, this is discussed in the Cells and Gels book, all of these processes involve a phase transition, which is a transition both in the proteins and the water. And that's at the heart of the action of the cell is this transition. And then after the contraction is over or the secretion is over, it reverts back to the default state, relaxed state or unactivated state. And so all of these processes involve a transition from easy water to ordinary liquid water and then back again. But if you don't have a full complement of easy water to start with, you can't go through this cycle, or it's not as effective, and your cell will be dysfunctional. And to make it functional again, one approach is to make sure that you've got enough easy water, a full complement of easy water. So how do you get it? And there are a half dozen expedients that can be used, and one of them um, is to take some of these substances that I mentioned in reasonable quantity, and they will promote. We found in the lab they build easy, and they're known to promote health. Another one is drink a lot of water. So if you have to be hydrated, everybody knows that. You play 2 matches of tennis and you're practically dead. Then you drink a few liters of water and you're back again, at least partially. So what happens is that you take in the water and your body converts some of that liquid water to easy water. And it converts it because your body's filled with these hydrophilic surfaces, and you've got plenty of infrared energy coming from outside and inside.
So in terms of drinking more water, what would you advise people drank? Because the tap water isn't appropriate in lots of places, and doesn't fluorine collapse the easy as well a bit? So if people are drinking too much fluoridated tap water, that wouldn't be ideal. And just from your view, for people who are interested in water, what could they drink that's best for them? Because minerals must be important.
I'm sorry. I wish I could answer that question, but I can't even speculate on that. I know you don't mind some speculation. We certainly have no evidence, so we've not studied that. And it's hard. It's really hard even to speculate on it. So I think what I would refer you to is that there's a book called Quench, and it deals with hydration. And
Okay.
it's co-authored by a friend and colleague, Gina Bria, and I forget the other co-author, but she discusses in that book about what you need to drink, how much hydration, how much you need to achieve hydration, and I would defer to her.
Okay.
I have no answer.
No, that's fine. Because I think we'll go back to making more easy water ourselves. Because I know in your book you said that you had an amazing grounding experience burying yourself in the sand. Because again, I think back to the electrons and the sun and things like that, that's another source of being able to build easy. So maybe you want to talk a bit back to familiar territory.
So I'll start with my experience, and then I'll tell you the principle. So, I grew up in New York City, and in the summertime it's hot, so everybody migrates to the beaches, including myself. And I remember I was with some friends, and what do you do at the beach? Well, you go swimming and whatever. But we tried something different. We're right at the edge of the water at the beach. We buried one another. And I was the last one to be buried, and I was buried so that the only thing sticking out from underneath was my head. And I remember the experience of feeling, the feeling was, the words that come to mind is ecstasy and bliss.
Okay.
Those are the same words used by some of the people who do the so-called yogic flying. That's different.
Well, the thing is, ananda or anandamide means bliss, doesn't it? So I know what you're referring to with the yoga, the flying yoga. But yes, we'll come back to the grounding. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, the grounding. So at the time, I didn't, of course, understand principles or whatever. All I could do is remember. I remember so little about my youth, but I remember this feeling of bliss. I simply did not want to get unburied, but the tide was coming in, and it was the end of the day. It was time to leave. I just simply did not want to get unburied. I was so happy there and so blissful that I remember the feeling so well. Anyway, so what's going on there? Well, what I realize more recently is that what I'm doing is grounding myself. So the sand is pretty damp right near the water, and I'm connected to the earth. And now, does the earth have charge? Well, I began my career studying electrical engineering, and no professor ever even hinted that the Earth might have negative charge. It was presumed neutral. Nobody ever told me otherwise. And so when a Russian friend told me that the Earth was negatively charged, I thought he must be on some kind of drug. And the next day, a student came in and brought me the lectures of Richard Feynman, the famous Nobel laureate, and there it was in Volume 2, Chapter 9, massive amounts of evidence that the Earth is indeed negatively charged. I found out subsequently.
What date would that have been when it was confirmed the Earth is negatively charged? Because it's ridiculously recent, isn't it?
Well, no, because the Feynman lectures, this would have been in the 1950s.
Oh no, that's still very recent. That's what I meant, was people for thousands of years didn't know it was, and it sometimes takes a bit of time in science for something to be set in stone, especially this idea. But just out of curiosity, how long did it take for it to be accepted that the Earth had a negative charge?
I can't recall, and I don't know, they use the word accepted. So we, in the US, nobody knows about, almost nobody knows about it, because we're not taught. It's thought to be arcane, no relevance whatsoever. And so we don't learn it. In Russia, on the other hand, this same guy who told me, he said, every middle school student knows. And I thought this was true. I confirmed it with two Russians, one of whom worked in my laboratory about 30 years ago. We had dinner together, and I said, did you ever hear? Oh yeah, we learned this in middle school. And then I was teaching 2 days ago, and there was a student who had a Russian accent who asked a question, and I captured her afterward, and I said, hey, did you ever learn in middle school? So she was now an undergraduate at University of Washington. Did you learn in middle school about the Earth's negative charge? She said no. So I'm not sure if she's an anomaly, or maybe they stopped teaching it because they thought also that it's irrelevant. So we're talking about evidence from 100 years ago up to 50 years ago, and I don't think anybody has touched on this since that time. And why I'm mentioning it is that if you connect yourself to the Earth, you're connecting yourself to negative charge, to a practically infinite supply of negative charge. And what does that negative charge do? So now I tell you about what we found in the lab. We took water, ordinary liquid water, and we stuck an electrode, 2 electrodes in, and passed electrons through the negative electrode. And we found that around this negative electrode, easy water built. And the more negative charge we put in, the more easy we got. So if you apply this principle to us, if you connect yourself to the negative Earth, electrons will flow into your body, and electrons will build easy water. And according to the paradigm I'm talking about, if you build easy water, you should feel better. Your cells will function better. And a lot of people have found that. This is now a pretty big field, so-called earthing or grounding. And a lot of people are doing it, and an almost equal number of people are speculating about how it might work. I think it works very simply just by building easy water.
Because I think that would lead in now to talk about blood flow, because again, for health reasons, sometimes it takes people a while to grasp the concept of how important easy water is. And I think one of the main leading studies with the grounding is it improves blood flow and stops blood vessels sticking to each other, and they're able to squeeze themselves through very small capillaries. But again,
red blood cells, yeah.
Yes, yeah. You'll know more about this as well anyway.
Okay, well, I'll tell you the story of that. But the bottom line is of the story is yeah, that infrared energy may be important in propelling your blood. In other words, it may be that it's not just your heart, but the vessels that pump the blood. And it started with an observation in our laboratory. We took a tube made of hydrophilic material. The material is called Naphion, but it's not so important. And one of the students did this experiment spontaneously. And he stuck it in the water with microspheres. So the microspheres are only so that he could track the water movements. You can't track water moving very easily, but if you got something in the water, you can track that something, and which reflects the movement of the water. And one day he came barging into my office when I was with some important visitor, and I pretended I was irritated, but the visitor was not so interesting. So I was very happy that he barged in. He said, "I found something I got to tell you." And, well, okay, what did you find? I was expecting nothing. He said, I put the tube in the water, the Nafion tube, and I found that the water is flowing through the tube like through a straw, and it doesn't stop, just keeps going. And I thought, wow, this is a really interesting observation, because usually you need pressure to drive flow through a tube, especially narrow tubes. And there's no obvious pressure here. You need a pressure difference from the one end to the other end, just like created by your heart that builds pressure, drives flow through the large vessels. So this is very interesting, and it turns out that there are so many applications of this throughout nature, including the flow from the bottom to the top of a 300-foot or 100-meter redwood tree, which nobody can understand. It's to an enormous height, and the same principle that's driving flow through the tube. And we understand pretty much how it works. But then soon after that discovery, I made a trip to Russia, and I visited my friend who's a professor and vice chair of biochemistry at Moscow University, Vladimir Vyakov, and he introduced me to a neighbor who was a scientist next door, and he wanted me to hear what they had to say. And so what they had to say was, there's a big problem in the cardiovascular system. And I thought, okay, come on, big problem? Everybody knows how the cardiovascular system works. What kind of big problem are you talking about? And I must admit that I was feeling a bit arrogant, because I knew something about the cardiovascular system. I did my PhD studying the pressures and flows throughout the cardiovascular system. And I thought, it's pretty straightforward. It's all worked out. Everything is clear. So as the Israelis like to say, they had their nose in the clouds, feeling of arrogance. On the other hand, in 5 minutes, he had me convinced that there was really a problem in the cardiovascular system. So what's the problem? The problem is this: the red blood cells, which you mentioned, red blood cells are 6 or 7 micrometers in diameter. Compared to that 6 or 7 micrometers, the vessels, the capillaries through which they have to flow, is half of that. The smallest ones are half of that, 3 or 4 micrometers in diameter. And I've seen some even narrower. So if you think about it, in order to get those red blood cells to flow through a channel that's half of the diameter, they've got to squeeze, they've got to bend somehow. And you could see it in videos of blood flow in the capillaries. Those red blood cells are actually squeezed and bent. That's how they can work their way through. Why it's that way is another issue that beyond what we're discussing. But he said that correctly, that it requires energy to do that. And so he was curious how much energy is required, and he calculated it. And we all know that, calculations might or might not be correct. But anyway, his calculation was that if the heart were fully responsible for driving the blood through these tiny capillaries, it would need to develop a pressure much higher than it actually develops. And his calculation is that the amount of pressure that the left ventricle would need to develop is higher by 1 million times, 1 million.
Whoa.
Now,
That's a big factor to be out by.
yeah, it's a big factor. And, you know,
Yeah.
if he's off by a factor of 10 or 100 or something,
Yeah.
still, you know, we're talking about thousands, tens of thousands of times. And so it seems seemingly obvious that there must be some other source. And he began speculating about bubbles in the blood or other things. And meanwhile, I'm not listening so carefully, and I'm thinking, my goodness, we found in the laboratory that if you have a tube, a hydrophilic tube, and the capillaries are hydrophilic tubes, that you get flow spontaneously. And it has to do with the exclusion zone and the charge separation. I don't need to go into detail unless you ask me later. But we tested, actually a student in my lab, Jing Li, tested to see whether it's possible that the mechanism that we found in the laboratory applies in the cardiovascular system. And the first thing he did, well, he used a preparation of a chick embryo, a 3-day-old chick embryo. And so, you know, the embryo develops and the cardiovascular system develops, and at 3 days old, it's pretty well developed, but the neurological and hormonal regulation systems are not so well developed. So it's pretty pure system. And he was able to look at various vessels and to test the hypothesis that the mechanism that we discovered is applicable. So first thing he did was he stops the heart. And you'd expect that if you stop the heart, that the flow will stop. It doesn't stop, it keeps going at a much lower velocity. But imagine the heart stops, but the blood keeps flowing. And he's not the first to find that. He found some half-dozen papers in the literature over the past 100 years, each in a different context, a different preparation, different animal, whatever, scattered around, but nobody's aware of those papers. So anyway, he found that when he stopped the heart, completely stopped by injecting potassium chloride, the blood kept going at low velocity, and then a lower velocity. And then what he did was to test to see if the signature feature of what we found in the laboratory applied here. And that is, if you apply infrared energy, that's the energy that's needed to build EZ, it flows faster. And he did the experiment, and he found with the infrared source that reversibly, that he could increase the flow by a factor of more than 3 times. And then he turned off the infrared, and it went back to the control value. So he showed that it appears that in the cardiovascular system, the flow is propelled not only by the ventricle, but also by the vessels themselves. And if we're correct in that, you know, one never knows. The common expression in science that even the most beautiful of theories can be destroyed by one ugly fact.
Oh, definitely. But that's a really important thing you've brought up, because in terms of atherosclerosis, why do plaques build up only in certain parts of the cardiovascular system? And do you think that because I did my postdoc on lipids and cholesterol, do you think that's the complete red herring, and it's actually we should be looking at structured water and water for as a route into heart health?
Well, yeah, I mean, what we found, and also has been found 50, 60 years ago, is that red blood cells in the larger vessels anyway, they stay away from the walls. Something keeps them away. And the zone in which you don't see red blood cells is substantial. And you know, so what is that? Well, people have been talking about the so-called glycocalyx, but that's only about 1 micrometer thick. But the evidence is that in the larger vessels, that the erythrocytes stay away from the walls at roughly 100 micrometers, so 100 times the thickness of the glycocalyx. So something else is going on. We did some experiments, not published, early on, to see whether red blood cells approach the walls, and 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 we opened up some vessels and exposed them to red blood cells, and we found that they stayed away. In other words, they were excluded. And we think that there's an exclusion zone that builds inside. And so the exclusion zone keeps everything away, at least in the larger vessels, keeps them from the wall. But if there's a pathology of some sort, and the exclusion zone is not growing in a particular region, then that region is susceptible to all kinds of influences. And so it might be, we haven't studied extensively, but it might be that that's the critical factor, the existence of an annular exclusion zone just inside the vessel. And if through some pathology that disappears, it opens the vessel to all kinds of pathology and trauma. So
so is it, so I was just going to say, I mean, with fluid dynamics, is there anything particularly special about the arteries, the coronary arteries that like to collect plaques, and the ones in the brain? Because we've got those kind of vessels everywhere. Why don't we get it in the liver and elsewhere? Or is it just we notice we have a heart attack or a stroke? Whereas
I wish I could comment on that, but I can't. We haven't studied it, and I haven't thought about it. So anything I would say is even beyond speculation. So maybe let's go to the next question.
Yes, I think because we've talked about different organs, and I didn't have this in my questions I prepared for you. Well, have you got any information or new studies or things you haven't published about EZ in the brain?
No, we haven't studied EZ in the brain.
Okay.
Most of the studies that we've been doing the past decade or so have been outside of biology.
Yeah, that's what I thought. I wondered if you just knew anything about EZ in the brain anyway, or where I could look, or is it just something that it's too new?
Well, let me just say something about EZ in the brain. The brain cells, they're nerve cells and other cells, and they, in essence, they should be the same as other. But the brain does processing and has memory, and that leads to the question of the memory of water. And I think you were interested in that. So
oh yeah, definitely. I was going to come to that a bit later, because again, that can upset people, and people think it's taboo. But I'll just let you carry on about the biological relevance of water and memory, because I'm really excited now.
Well, I think it's exciting too, and I also realized that when you mention that topic, many people simply turn off because it seems too woo-woo and exotic and unbelievable and impossible. And but so the person who is probably the most famous for this is the late Japanese spiritualist Masaru Emoto. And so what Emoto did to demonstrate information in water is he took water and he would focus his intention on the water or play music to the water, and he'd freeze the water, and then he would look at the crystals, the ice crystals that formed in the freezing process. And he found that if his intention was positive, if he'd been thinking peace or love or something like this, the crystals were beautiful. And if he thought evil thoughts or negative thoughts, the crystals were ugly. And he did the same with music. He played, if he played John Lennon, Imagine, or Mozart Symphony, or whatever, he'd get beautiful crystals. And heavy metal was pretty ugly, et cetera, et cetera. And so he wrote a book on this, demonstrating them, and the book sold millions of copies. And so a lot of people became interested because it looked as though there was information could be conveyed and stored in the water, and this is about as weird seeming as it gets. And scientists of the mainstream rejected for two reasons. First of all, it's weirdness, and secondly, the way Emoto did his experiments was not particularly scientific. He'd project his emotions or consciousness to the water, but he'd put the water in 50 different petri dishes and freeze them all. and he selected the one that demonstrated what he wanted to demonstrate best. So, any scientist worth his or her worth would say, this is not science, right? And so I know of very few scientists who take his work seriously. On the other hand, I know of a lot of spiritually oriented people who do. And there have been follow-ups. There's a woman from New Zealand, Veda Austin, who has been demonstrating the repeatability of this. I must say a little bit of my influence in pushing her to do that. But anyway, that's just, so it all started, the idea of water memory started with, beforehand, was Jacques Benveniste, a distinguished French scientist who basically lost his career on the basis. And he found evidence for the memory of water. I won't go into his experiments, but these were scientific experiments. But again, people from the establishment, particularly the editor of the journal Nature, said this is impossible. And I don't care how many people repeat it, and there were lots of people who repeated it with similar results. It's not. I won't believe it. And he sent a delegation to. He agreed to publish a paper. The editor, their paper, and he, in the condition that he send a delegation of people to look over their shoulders, and figure out what's going on. And the committee consisted of the editor himself, who, had didn't want to be proved wrong, and someone from the U.S. National Institutes of Health in the fraud section, because they suspected some kind of fraud, and a magician, the amazing Randy, who was one of the most famous magicians. They went, and they couldn't find the trick that Benveniste played, but they said basically that, they were really sloppy in their data collection. They destroyed his career basically because they published in Nature that this is a delusion, a trick. And his career went from a scientist of distinction downhill, and he died some years after, prematurely, fairly despondent. Okay, so
that's terrible. What about the ability to structure water using electricity? When you can put a trace representing a particular substance into water using certain chips. What are your thoughts on that level of structuring water? Because we mentioned doing it with our mind and intention, or with sound and then light, and then now what about electricity and structuring?
We did an experiment, we published it, and we found that certain frequencies were able to structure the water, other frequencies not.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't gone beyond that, but this is reminiscent of the PEMF, pulsed electromagnetic fields, that are used. So
yes, that's what I was, because I know Anton from infopathy, and I'm not particularly good at physics, and I had a chat with him, and yes, it is the PEMF, and I think it's either it all comes down to we don't understand water properly, and that's why people think, well, it's so ridiculous. How can you possibly make a resonance of Valium or Prozac in water and then drink it and have the effect? But I think from everything you've been saying earlier, we don't, some people understand water, but the general consensus is it's too woo-woo. So that's why I brought up the electricity, because I'm really interested in what you think about it as well.
Well, yes, electricity is at the center of all of nature, not just biology, but beyond biology. And I have a book coming out in about 6 months that illustrates the huge influence, or the centrality, of electricity in all of nature, way beyond what we ordinarily think. So yes, I think there's been enough.
Do you think you can structure water into compounds using pulse fields electronics, or do you think it's not possible?
Well, I wouldn't speculate on anything that's not possible.
Yeah. No, I know. Oh, I the thing is, anyway, back to your yes, because I think it's one of these things. I think it's with these devices. I've got one. It's like suck it and see. Like, be a scientist, do your own experiments, and see what happens. But yes, I knew you had a new book coming out, but I didn't know what it was on. So, what inspired you to write a book on electricity, or has it been building throughout your life?
The latter. It's been building throughout my life.
Mm.
I started my career, as I said, studying electrical engineering,
Mm.
and I immediately diverted from anything electrical and studying muscle. Turns out that muscle, there's a lot of electricity.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, hey, I wasted 4 undergraduate years studying electrical engineering, and I'm not doing anything. So finally, it returns, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure how to answer your question exactly, except to say that what moves me is to try to figure out how nature works.
Mm.
And there are so many areas of nature that we don't understand. So I'll give you one example that's in the book: weather.
Oh, this is a great one, because some people think that there's somebody making like a conspiracy theory that we can make weather. But yes, carry on. Yeah.
Well, it's possible that we can make weather.
Yeah.
Uh, um, if you first of all, you need to understand the principles of weather, and so I I I'm curious, and I started looking to find textbooks and looking in the internet, and I can't find any description of weather starting from first principles of physics and chemistry. I mean, it occurs, right? And um, uh, so how does a cloud form? How does evaporation really occur?
And why don't clouds fall out of the sky?
Right. Yeah, there's water, and if you climb to the level of a cloud and with a pail of water and turn the pail over, the water would come down like a waterfall. But the clouds don't do that. And when it does rain, how come it rains in droplets rather than in one big swoosh of water coming down? So these are all the questions. How do you get a hurricane? What creates a typhoon or a twister? Or, there are so many questions. All of these things happen, and there's no explanation for it. No explanation that starts from fundamental principles and builds logically
Mm.
to explain all of these phenomena. You'll find a lot of talk on low pressure, high temperature, whatever. But if you start looking into it and asking the questions, well, how do you get from A to B to C? There's a complete disconnect, and most of the field now is not oriented. The field of atmospheric science and understanding weather, it mostly looks at they do computer analysis of patterns that are similar to the pattern that exists today, and from that historical influence, they suggest what the weather is going to be. That's the focus of pretty much the entire field. Almost nobody is studying the chemistry and physics, and it's not understandable. At least I couldn't find it, and so.
Okay.
So
Because I know in the Bible, there's lots of talk about being able to create and learn how to make storms and lightning and rain and stuff. So I just think you kind of really captured me now with I know we've digressed from what we were meant to talk about, but I just think what you've just said is so interesting. And what else in the book, or what have you discovered about weather that you could share a bit?
Well, there's nothing that I've discovered more than you can see, right? I don't mean, it's the origin of weather, how it all happens, and there's a lot. So, for example, I'll just give one example. Did you ever sit at Starbucks and enjoyed a coffee and looked around and you've seen the vapor rising? Right, you've seen, if you have a dark background, a dark wall or something, you can see the steam or vapor coming up, right? This is a common observation. So what does that imply? Just think about it. In order for you to see something, it's got to be it scatters light. And the reason you don't see the air is that the molecules are so small, they don't scatter a whole lot of light, so you don't see it, right? In order to see something, it has to be, the size has to be at least equal to the wavelength of the light that's being used to see it. So the wavelength of light is roughly half a micron, 1 micron. So that means the evaporating water must be roughly the size of a micron. Well, people have actually studied it, a few people. It turns out that the evaporating entity, the unit of evaporation, is like 30 or 40 microns. Now, 30 or 40 microns is how many billion water molecules evaporating at the same time.
Whoa.
Now, we're told in the textbook that the way evaporation occurs is one molecule of water gets a kick of, I guess, potential energy or kinetic energy, and it passes from the liquid water to the vapor. It's obviously there must be more to it than that, because of what I just, so simple observation and primitive physics, simple physics says that the evaporation differs from what we think. And so this is just one. So, it turns out that the evaporation occurs in clusters, and we've reported that it occurs one bolus at a time, and each bolus is huge. So you get a bolus of vapor followed by another one, followed by another one, and you can actually photograph it. We have done so. So this kind of evaporation differs astonishingly from what we're told in the textbook.
But that's fundamentally so important. If we don't even know how water changes phases, there's gonna be glaring problems elsewhere in our scientific knowledge, because this is a really basic, fundamental phenomenon. And if it's incorrect, it's kind of quite disturbing, I find.
I'm completely and absolutely with you. When you have a foundation that has cracks in it, you can't build a secure structure on such a foundation. And and it just multiplies. Everything that's built on the concept of one molecule at a time is going to go wrong. Or in order to make it fit, it's going to have all kinds of wounds and patches and struts and things to hold it all together. It's simply wrong. And so that, more generally is where I come from. I want to find out how things work. And I have a tendency to dig and dig and dig until we get something that feels secure, and then rebuild on that secure foundation. And when you rebuild on the foundation, you come up with answers that are different from what you read in the textbook. That's what propels me.
Oh, no, but that's wonderful, though, because you've been so generous with your time. I just wanted to ask one more question. I think it's going to tie in the electricity now, and it's about sort of aging and biological functions. So do you think it's right, part of aging is we run out of electricity and we run out of structured water, and if it is those, where does the structured water go, and also maybe why do you think we age? Because you think in a different way to so many people that I know.
Okay, I can tell you my speculation.
Yes.
I don't know if it's right. What causes aging? Well, so I'm not sure where to start. Let me start. Our body is negatively charged. All of our cells are negatively charged. You stick an electrode in the cell and you measure an electrical potential difference, 100 millivolts, 80 millivolts, negative. And all of our cells are that way. And even actually the connective tissue outside also bears a negative charge. And so we're an entity of negative charge. If we're bombarded in some way with positive charge, it basically destroys the easy water, which is negatively charged, right? It compromises, and then our cells are not working anymore, or not working properly. And the new proteins that get built are not the same as the natural proteins. And our DNA is impacted and such. And okay, so if we're somehow bombarded with enough positive charge, it's gonna impact and create a decline in our being. So how might that happen? Well, I got a hint. I was with my late wife. We were on a safari in Africa, and we were driving along in a vehicle, and we come upon some structures that looked like upside down cones with a point at the top, and there were whole fields of these. And I'd never seen that before. And I asked the guide, "What are those?" And he was shocked that I didn't know what they were. They're termite mounds. And so I asked a lot of questions, and he was focusing on the termites that were inside the mound. So there were three. There's, just like the bees, there's a soldier, there's the worker, and there's the queen. They all come from the same batch of eggs. How the queen is chosen, nobody knows, but they all have the same genetic content. The soldiers go out, fight their battles, come back in. The workers go out, do whatever they need to do, come back. But the queen stays inside, buried under this giant mound. Well, he was telling me something very strange, that despite the fact that they're all from the same batch of eggs, the queen lives 50 years, approximately 55 years, and the soldiers and the workers, they live only a matter of a month or two.
Oh, right.
So what's the difference? Well, being the scientist that I am, I'm thinking, well, what might be the difference? And I'm thinking the ones that go out are exposed to cosmic energy. And what's cosmic energy? Well, cosmic energy consists of coming from all over. It consists of either protons, positive charges, or alpha particles, which are helium nuclei, which are also positive. So we're all bombarded by these positive charges all the time. They work against our health. And the interesting feature with these termites, the lifespan, despite the same genetic content, is enormously different. I found the same thing later. It's true of bees. And
yeah, my dad used to keep bees, so I knew about the really old queens.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
the queens live on, and they're not exposed to this.
Yeah.
And I found later there was spiders that were essentially the same, but there were some terrestrial ones and some that live in caves. And the ones that live in caves, the numbers are almost the same. They live 100 times longer than the ones that are not living subterranean. So out of this came the possibility of a generality that.
What about mammals, though? Because those are all insects. Do moles live longer than they should?
Well, yeah, okay, that's true. And also the larger mammals tend to live longer than the smaller ones. So there are some insects that live for one day, but trees, for example, some like baobab trees live 5,000 years.
Okay. So with the cosmic rays, if you're bigger and you go outside, you've got a bit more protection. So I was just wondering if moles, because they live underground, whether they kind of. I'll look it up myself later. But
I don't know. That's a good question, but
yeah.
I don't know.
And then, is an elephant more resistant to these positive particles than a mouse? I mean, I know aging has got loads of other facets to it, but what you've just touched upon, I'm completely in delight of what you're talking about. So I just wanted to sort of contextualize it a bit to mammals.
Well, I have to follow this. It's on my list, but there are so many things on my list that it's really hard to do it. But it's a real question about what determines the duration of life. And so I think one factor would be where the critical organs are, how close they are to the surface, how susceptible the body is to like turtles, for example, they have these shells, they live for a long time.
Oh,
And yeah, so I'm interested in pursuing to see whether this speculation right now, this is speculation, whether it makes sense. There's got to be something,
but
it's not.
it would though, because then you've got really long living animals that live in the sea. Like there are certain whales and sharks and things that aren't there some that are 300 years old.
I was not aware, but that's interesting. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, could be. Um,
Yes.
so all these need time to study, and this is a problem I have is that in Seattle where I live, the day has 24 hours. That's it. Um, so maybe where you live, maybe days are longer, but if you can figure out a way to, to figure out how to extend the day, I would really appreciate that.
I know. I think there's so many things that I want to do, and I think it's been really fascinating. What you said at the end. And so, when can people buy this new book, and what's it going to be called, and where can people learn more about you and your work, and follow you, and such like?
Well, apart from reading the book, The Fourth Phase of Water, which, as I said, has become really popular. The new book should be coming out in perhaps 6 months. It's done pretty much. The limiting factor is my son, who's the artist, who has been busy remodeling his home and is slowly transitioning back to illustrating the book. It's really, the ball is in his court, and I'm projecting that the book will be out in 6 months. It's called Charged, and then there's a subtitle, and I forget exactly the words in the subtitle, but it's like the role of electricity in nature or something like this. And there's one beyond that that's coming about the structure of the atom, and we're out of time, maybe.
Oh no, the thing is, no, actually, that's a really good thing you didn't tell me that, because I did do quantum physics at university, and I would have gone crazy if I knew that it could go that way. But that's another really exciting era. But and I think also your first book is, I haven't got this one. The one, is it gels? What's the
Well, it's not really my first book. There's a book on muscle contraction, but the
yeah.
second book, it's called Cells, Gels, and the
Gel.
Engines of Life.
Okay, great. That's great. So that's the three, but well, there's two books for people to get, and then they can look out for the third and then the fourth one when your son gets
Well,
around.
the next one and the one after, they're pretty much prepared, but waiting for his illustration. He's
Oh,
transitioning now from construction to art, and he has enormous talent. I wouldn't switch to any other artist, so it's worth waiting. I've been waiting 3 years.
oh no. Well, the thing is, I'm really excited about these books of yours, but I suppose all the knowledge is there that now that we know what else you do, because I know you're known for just water, and I knew you were an electrical engineer before, but I didn't know you had these two books all ready to share with us as well. So that's
I
something.
do, and I'm extremely excited about that.
Yes.
And I'm, just not sure what to do, which book to work on next. Life is so busy, especially trying to keep my lab. If you do controversial work, it's difficult to get funding,
Mm.
and we're obviously, I spend a lot of my time looking for funding to keep the experiments going. The theory is not an issue, but there are many experiments that I would like to be able to do, and they require people and they require money, and it's difficult to get the money from usual sources because the reviewers, many of the reviewers, for example, if you propose something to do with water, they'll send it to the establishment people who study water, and we're stepping on their toes, and so the way the system is built, it's not conducive to getting funding. So we had a long-term funder who really believed in our work and still does, but he ran into a financial obstacle and he couldn't continue. So we're looking. Anyway, our website is probably a good place to look. It's Pollack Lab, POLLACK Lab, one word, .org. And there you can find us and you can see what's going on. There's some stuff in Facebook. I don't really do these various platforms, but there's someone in my lab who does, and there's some stuff that appears on the Facebook page, but going to our lab is probably the best place because you can get a fuller idea of what we're about. Thank you for asking that.
Oh no, it's fine, because the thing is, there's a lot more, because you're really modest and stuff, and there's always a lot more to you than, you know, there's a lot more, because I haven't even delved into everything that you do, because it's like a whole, Dr. Pollack is like a rabbit hole all of its own, of things to learn about and study, and I've read the fourth phase of water twice, and there's still things that I can't quite get my head around, but it's really worth looking into your stuff, and I'm so excited that you've got more books coming out, and you know, and that people are, you know, that your people are aware of you. So I know you know, you've been really generous with your time. So I just wanted to thank you so much for coming and talking to me and my audience about something I think is so important.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity, Sarah, and hope we get to meet one another in person.
Oh yes, definitely. And if and when I ever become a millionaire, I'll come and do research and fund it myself in your lab. So, you know,
you're absolutely welcome.
Okay.
Okay,
Thank
take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye.